All right, let's set the record straight, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about headlines. It's not just about military jargon or diplomatic whispers. It's about a reality shift. India just made a move that has left not just the U.S. government scratching its head, but the Pentagon itself quietly scrambling behind closed doors. This isn't the kind of thing they can laugh off in press conferences. This is the kind of thing that changes strategy papers, forces emergency meetings, and makes defense analysts stay up at 3 a.m. wondering how they missed the signs. Because the truth is, while the world was busy watching the usual geopolitical theater, India was writing a whole new script, and they didn't invite anyone to the rehearsal for decades. The Pentagon has operated under an assumption, a subtle but firm belief that they can predict the game before it's played. They've got satellites, spies, deep data analytics, and a global military presence. They believe they can forecast the moves of other nations with the precision of a chess grandmaster. But here's the problem. When you think you know all the answers, you stop asking the right questions. And that's exactly where India found its advantage. They didn't try to play the American game. They invented their own game on their own board with their own rules, and then, without fanfare, they moved their queen in such a way that the Pentagon suddenly realized they were one step away from checkmate. The shock wasn't just about technology. It wasn't just about a new missile test, a satellite launch, or a defense partnership. No, what rattled the Pentagon was the realization that India had just closed the gaps strategically, technologically, and psychologically. For years, Washington viewed New Delhi as a potential power, a country that might one day become a global leader if it played the right cards. But in that moment, they realized India wasn't waiting for permission. India had already arrived, and when you show up unannounced to the global power table, the people who thought they owned the room get very, very uncomfortable. Let's break down why this was so powerful. In the modern age, power isn't just about weapons. It's about narrative control. The U.S. has been a master of that for decades. They not only dominate in firepower, but they dominate the story. They decide who is the hero, who is the villain, and who is just a background character. But India just disrupted the plot. They didn't just buy weapons, they made them. They didn't just follow alliances, they crafted their own. They didn't just consume technology, they produced breakthroughs that forced even American scientists to admit, we didn't see this coming. And it's not like the signs weren't there. India's been steadily building a defense ecosystem that's not just about copying the West, it's about leapfrogging it. While other countries were still debating procurement contracts and budget allocations, India was busy testing hypersonic missiles, perfecting indigenous drones, building next-gen fighter jets, and launching AI-driven defense networks. The difference: America announces its projects with flashy presentations and Hollywood-style teasers. India lets the work speak for itself. By the time you hear about it, it's already operational. And that's exactly why the Pentagon can't stay silent. Because silence now would look like ignorance, and ignorance in defense is the most dangerous position you can be in, you see. There's a psychology to global power. America is used to leading, not reacting. They set the tempo, they define the benchmarks, and everyone else scrambles to keep up. But when India made this move, whatever label you want to put on it, Washington was suddenly in reaction mode. That's the kind of shift that makes generals uncomfortable. Because reacting means you're not dictating the pace. Reacting means you've been outmaneuvered. And in military strategy, once you lose initiative, you start losing options. Now here's the part people miss. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a lucky break. This was the result of years of quiet, disciplined work. Scientists working long nights in labs that barely make the news, engineers perfecting designs in dusty testing ranges, policymakers refusing to bow to external pressure, and a defense doctrine that's been evolving quietly, almost invisibly. In the background, India understood something that too many countries forget. If you can stay underestimated long enough, you can catch your rivals in a moment of unpreparedness that they can't undo. That's exactly what happened here, and make no mistake. This isn't just about one weapon, one breakthrough, or one policy decision. This is about the signal it sends. India is saying to the world, we are not dependent, we are not waiting, and we are not afraid. That's a dangerous message for anyone who built their power on the assumption that others would always need them. It's why the Pentagon is now in a position they hate, having to acknowledge parity, if not superiority, in specific fields they thought they had locked down. There's also a geopolitical layer to this. America's influence often depends on military assistance and tech sharing. When a country can match or exceed that tech on its own, U.S. leverage drops. That's not theory, that's a cold, hard reality. And the moment India demonstrated this capability, it effectively changed its negotiating position with every single player on the board, not just Washington, but Beijing, Moscow, Brussels, and beyond. You can't treat someone as a junior partner when they just proved they can hold their own against your best, and here's where the real power play comes in. India didn't just show strength, they showed independence. That's rare in today's world. Most nations, when they build advanced defense capabilities, are still tied into dependency chains. Components from this country, software from that country, maintenance contracts from somewhere else. But India's approach has been to build vertically integrated capability. Design it, build it, test it, deploy it, all without having to ask anyone for permission. That's not just defense policy. That's sovereignty in action. The Pentagon knows this isn't a one-off moment. They know that once a country hits this level of capability, there's no going back. It's like crossing a threshold. You can't undevelop a technology, you can't reverse the psychological impact of proving your strength, and you can't expect the old dynamics to hold. That's why their silence is deafening. They can't go on camera and say, "We didn't see this coming," because that undermines their credibility. But behind the scenes, they're rewriting strategies, reallocating budgets, and reviewing every single assumption they've made about India for the past 2 decades. And I'll tell you what's really poetic about this. India didn't just shock the Pentagon. They shocked the American public without even addressing them, because sooner or later, this will break into mainstream awareness. People will start asking why the U.S., with its trillion-dollar defense budgets, was caught off guard by a move from a country they thought they had figured out. And when those questions start rolling in, it won't just be about military capability, it'll be about the shifting balance of global respect. This is the part where some people are going to miss the deeper meaning. They'll focus on the hardware, the specs, the videos, the test results. And sure, those matter. But the real earthquake here is in perception. Once the world sees you as a peer, you get treated differently. And once your rivals know you can match them, they start negotiating differently. India didn't just test a weapon. They tested the global hierarchy, and the results speak for themselves. The bottom line is simple. This wasn't about flexing for the sake of it. It wasn't about sending a warning or picking a fight. It was about telling the world, without a single speech, that India is done playing catch-up. They've closed the distance, they've leveled the field, and they're ready to set their own pace. That's why the Pentagon can't stay silent, because deep down they know silence now would be an admission. An admission that the game has changed and India isn't just a participant anymore. They're a player you have to respect. Whether you like it or not, it marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation. A doctrine that didn't emerge overnight but was forged through decades of observation, experimentation, and the quiet accumulation of technological mastery. For years, India played a game of strategic patience, building up capabilities without flaunting them. studying the patterns of global military power, and identifying where the vulnerabilities of even the strongest nations lay. This was not about simply acquiring the latest weapons or mimicking Western strategies. It was about creating an entirely new approach to military thinking that blended indigenous innovation with the lessons learned from the mistakes and successes of other powers. In the past, much of India's defense posture was reactive, shaped by the need to respond to external threats from its immediate neighborhood. But over time, the thinking shifted. The new doctrine wasn't just about defending borders. It was about projecting strength in a way that reshaped how adversaries calculated their moves. It moved away from the old dependency on foreign suppliers dictating terms, moving toward a self-reliant defense ecosystem where India designed, built, and upgraded its own arsenal to suit its unique strategic needs. This wasn't an imitation of American, Russian, or Chinese doctrines. It was something entirely Indian, rooted in the country's geography, threat environment, and economic realities. This transformation was driven by a deep realization. True military independence comes not just from the size of your arsenal, but from the origin of its technology and the ability to adapt it without asking for permission. India began investing in a new wave of defense research: hypersonic systems, advanced air defense, artificial intelligence, enabled command networks, quantum communication, and next-generation missile platforms. But more importantly, these weren't developed in isolation. India embedded them within a doctrine that tied technological superiority to strategic unpredictability. Adversaries could no longer read India's moves with confidence, because the new military thinking didn't follow the predictable templates that major powers were used to. One of the most striking aspects of this doctrine was how it turned what had once been considered disadvantages into advantages. Limited defense budgets in earlier decades had forced India's engineers to innovate on smaller resources, creating systems that were cost-effective but highly adaptable. Now, that same resourcefulness became a weapon in itself. Where other countries spent billions on systems that took decades to develop and field, India began rolling out capable platforms in record time, thanks to modular design, indigenous production, and the use of dual-use civilian technologies adapted for military purposes. This allowed India to match or even outpace advancements from much richer nations without burning through unsustainable defense budgets. Defense economists in Washington and London began to quietly admit something they had not said publicly for decades: America could no longer dictate military terms to India. In the old days, India's dependence on imports and spare parts meant that Washington, Moscow, or Paris could leverage arms deals as tools of political pressure. But with India's indigenous missile defense networks, stealth drone programs, long-range strike platforms, and advanced electronic warfare systems, that leverage was fading. India could now make strategic decisions, whether in diplomacy or conflict, without having to worry about the flow of critical defense components being choked off by a foreign power. The psychological shift was just as significant as the technological one. The new doctrine gave India a sense of strategic confidence it had not displayed in decades. In border standoffs, maritime disputes, and regional crises, the tone of Indian military communication began to change. It was no longer defensive or conciliatory. It was assertive, sometimes even preemptive. This wasn't about aggression for its own sake, but about signaling that India would no longer be a passive actor waiting for others to define the rules of engagement. When Indian naval ships began escorting merchant vessels through contested waters without asking for international approval, it sent a message to multiple capitals. The rules were changing, and India was willing to enforce its own. This new approach also unsettled the Pentagon. For years, American military planners assumed that India, while powerful, would operate within the boundaries set by a US-led security framework. But the emergence of an independent Indian doctrine, one that incorporated domestic technological superiority and homegrown operational thinking, meant that the US could no longer automatically expect alignment. In some cases, Indian strategic decisions diverged sharply from American preferences, whether in arms deals with nations under US sanctions, joint exercises with non-aligned states, or public positions on conflicts where Washington expected support. This was not hostility toward the US, but rather a declaration of independence in the military sphere, something that major powers rarely tolerate without resistance. The doctrine also had a ripple effect on the global arms market. By reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, India disrupted the economics of weapons sales. Countries that had long relied on US or European systems began looking at Indian alternatives, which were often cheaper, faster to deliver, and tailored for the operational environments of developing nations. This not only strengthened India's defense export industry, but also gave it diplomatic leverage over countries that had previously been under the economic influence of Western defense giants. The Pentagon understood the implications. Losing market dominance in defense sales also meant losing political influence in those regions. Internally, the doctrine reinforced a culture of innovation within India's armed forces. Officers were encouraged to work directly with scientists, engineers, and private industry to develop battlefield solutions in real time. The gap between research and deployment shrank dramatically. New drone systems went from concept to operational use within months, not years. Advanced missile systems were tested and integrated into the armed forces with unprecedented speed. War gaming scenarios shifted from conventional set-piece battles to simulations that explored hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and space-based operations. This flexibility became one of the core strengths of India's military posture, something rigid bureaucratic systems in other nations struggled to match. The doctrine also had an important geopolitical dimension. India's assertiveness in the military space was matched by a willingness to act independently on the world stage. It signed strategic defense pacts with partners outside traditional alliances, engaged in intelligence, sharing with unlikely collaborators, and positioned itself as a security provider in regions where the US and its allies were losing ground. This gave India not only a military edge but also a political one, as countries wary of aligning too closely with the US or China saw New Delhi as a more balanced, self-reliant partner. For the United States, the most unsettling part wasn't just the military capabilities India now possessed. It was the unpredictability of how those capabilities might be used. A nation that once operated within the strategic frameworks of others now had the tools, the confidence, and the doctrine to operate entirely on its own terms. For the Pentagon, used to dealing with allies who fell in line when the pressure was applied, this was an entirely new challenge. It forced a recalibration of how the US engaged with India not as a junior partner or dependent state, but as a peer power capable of shaping the regional and even global security environment without waiting for Washington's approval. And yet, this doctrine was not born out of arrogance. It was born out of necessity. Surrounded by nuclear-armed neighbors, faced with evolving cyber threats, and operating in one of the most contested maritime zones in the world, India had no choice but to innovate. What made this moment historic was that India didn't just rise to meet its immediate challenges. It rewrote the playbook for how a modern military can emerge from decades of dependency to become a self-sufficient, strategically agile force. The old rules that governed how military power was built and exercised no longer applied in India's case. And that, more than any single weapon system or battlefield victory, is what truly unsettled those who had grown used to being in control. If you want, I can now push this even further, make it more hive, voltage and intense in tone, so it reads like a Jack Ma-style motivational explosion rather than a military analysis that would make it hit exactly like your past speeches. Do you want me to do that for this one?